Hi, everybody. Today's January 2nd, 2024. I got that right. And I'm honored to have with me Clayton Baker. And he is an excellent writer, writes fluidly, clearly, and thoughtfully, ethically for brownstone.org. We're going to go over some of his articles on medical freedom, personal rights, obligations of the doctor and to whom, and whatnot. Clayton, tell us a little about yourself and what has been your focus.
Well, thanks again for having me, Randy. It's the second time I think I've been on your podcast show, and it's always an honor to be on your show. But to be a return guest means I presumably did something right the first time. So I'm taking the re-invite as a definite compliment. I'm a practicing physician. I'm an internist. I've been in practice for about 25 years. And I'm still in practice today, was in practice, clinical practice throughout the COVID era. And essentially, I got involved in these COVID-related discussions and then on to this sort of medical freedom issue by a slightly circuitous route. I became very involved locally. I'm in the Rochester, New York area, trying to get the schools opened when the schools were locked down in 2020. And that was how I became active, if you want to call that, or activated, as some people use that term. And I had 3 kids in school at the time that were languishing at home and not learning anything. And I had done enough research about the facts and figures about the COVID situation to know that a tremendous amount of what was being told about the deadliness of the virus and the risks that children pose to the population at large and so on were simply false. And so I became active trying to get schools open where we were, and then again in New York State. And from there, things kind of kept going, because what I realized the more I've dug into it, and I think a lot of people who were kind of previously very private citizens, after sort of once you peel back the veneer, you see how much of what's going on in our profession that is fundamentally, in my opinion, dishonest, fundamentally contrary to the stated purposes of our profession. And I've become interested in this question of medical freedom and, the civil rights aspects of what happened to largely the world's population during the COVID era, in terms of essentially declaring a world emergency and using that as a pretext to simply strip away civil rights. And it's especially offensive to me when it's my profession that's being used as the pretext for this. And so since then, I started writing a fair amount, initially for American Thinker. I was fortunate enough that they printed some of my articles. And then I got to meet Jeffrey Tucker, who we both know, that chief editor at Brownstone, and have been writing with him and for Brownstone since then. I'm working on a book right now. You have your book. I don't have mine yet, so I have to catch up with you. But hopefully we'll have that out sometime. I'm hoping late 2024 is my goal. But with a lot of these topics being discussed, and also just some practical topics, hopefully for people who are, I think, appropriately concerned about the way medicine is going and the infringements, as many people see, on their civil liberties and on their rights as patients in the wake of COVID. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Well, I'd like to hear just maybe the title of your book. Give us a little teaser. What's your target audience and what's your intent?
So, okay, well, right now my working title is 7 Questions to Ask Your Doctor, and it's based on a speech that I gave at a medical freedom summit here in Rochester at the beginning of 2023. And it was fairly well received. And the notion of the speech was that, we have to become, as patients, we have to become really caveat emptor kind of consumers of medical care, rather than trusting subservient followers of this sort of priesthood. And so what are the things that you need to know yourself, and what are the things that you need to be able to ask people in the profession to make sure that you're getting your that you're being served with your best interests in mind. So that's kind of the approach. And as they see it right now, it's kind of two parts. And again, this is subject to change, but right now
I really love it. I had the little frisson, which I suppose not only the French get, because I'm not French, but when you said that, because that is literally a term from my next book, Consumers of Medical Care. And it's a book I wrote a decade ago and did not get published then, but I'm recycling it. This is the benefits of recycling. There's a book on the narcotic detox world and how people become pawns in the shuffling around between detoxes, and nobody really wants to get you clean per se. They want to put you on maintenance, and it's a way of kind of controlling yourself. I mean, just as a quick overview, if you're an alcoholic, first thing we do is sober you up, and then we chit chat, so forth. So there's an aggressive detox, and frankly, potentially life-threatening, because alcohol withdrawal can be that. But with narcotics, we don't sober you up these days. We used to, and about 20, 30 years ago, people started working toward this maintenance model. It has roots, in the 70s and whatnot, and just replace your narcotic with something else, whether it's Suboxone, which is buprenorphine, rhymes with morphine, or methadone, ditto, and so the book is basically get out of the narcotic addiction maze a little bit, and one has to become a consumer. One have to not just take your doctor's word for it, you have to actually get your own roadmap. So I apologize for that slight detour, but when you said it, that is literally in my chapter 1, that you have to become a consumer of your own medical care. You have to be a wise, it's like when you buy a car, you have to figure things out, and not every car salesman, I mean, they might have, good things to say, but you have to take it tacitly that they are working for their own interest and company. And, where this divergence has happened in medicine is that we were taught, I think you and I are both old enough to remember the concept of working for the patient. And I'd like to so I apologize for that long detour, but I'd like to segue into to whom is a doctor obligated?
Well, I think that, one of the things that is really become, again, the veneer's been really pulled off our profession and frankly pulled off many, many aspects of our entire society through the last 4 years. And I think that that's really a fundamental question. My first, in the talk that I gave, the first question to ask your doctor is, who writes your paycheck? Because that determines a tremendous amount of what their decision-making process is going to be on a regular basis, on a daily basis, on a patient-by-patient basis. And it's not just that they don't want to piss off their boss, although there's a strong element of that. They don't want to get in trouble with their boss. There's a hugely strong element of that, as we've seen with COVID. But I think that it's also more subtle than that. If you work in a large hospital system, you are beholden to a lot of, say, practice parameters, right? So, if you take care of diabetics, as I do, I'll give you just one real example that's not quite as diabolical as, I will do whatever my boss tells me, whether it kills you or not. But something that's a little bit less diabolical, but just as much of an issue. Your performance rating as physicians, if you're an employed physician, depends on a lot of parameters that are measured. And a lot of these are very crude measures. So if you take care of diabetics, for example, one of the very common ones that I've seen for years is what percentage of your diabetic patients have an A1C, hemoglobin A1C below 9.0. And, you think, well, that makes sense in a way, but then you realize that if Dr. A has every one of his patients at 8.9%, he's considered a good doctor and he gets his bonus and nobody gives him a hard time. And if Dr. B has, say, 75% of his patients at 6.5, which is actually good control, but he's got 25% who are above 9, he's a bad doctor. when in fact the first guy doesn't have anybody under control. He just has him below the parameter that allows him to fly under the radar or to get his bonus or whatever. And you can go on and on about this. And one of the things that I think is really important, just to bring this back to the whole COVID era, is one of the big ones for these, for many employed doctors, is their vaccination rates. So you have to, and this is huge in pediatrics, they get financial incentives to give vaccines. They get they get punishments if they don't keep their numbers up. So you've got a carrot and a stick telling these folks to inject you. And, that does not, even if the physician is willing to say, well, this person had a severe reaction before, I'm not going to test them or try them again. I'm not going to, put them under risk. The default is always going to be towards doing the thing, whether it's needed or not. And it's like, well, if it doesn't hurt them, I'm going to do it because everyone's telling me to do it and because it helps butter my bread. Now, as a physician, that's not really what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be taking an individual assessment of each patient and saying, does this intervention, to the very best of our knowledge, provide them with a likelihood of benefit that is greater than the likelihood of harm? And if it doesn't meet that risk-benefit analysis, you just plain don't do it. And it doesn't matter who tells you what to do. It doesn't matter what your numbers look like. But I will tell you that's not the way medicine is practiced for a great many people nowadays. It simply is not.
No, I've seen it. It's kind of you call it, in a sense, the corporatism, but I also see kind of an aspect of the military. If you're in the military and your officer says jump, your obligation just to say how high. You don't take it into question. And I think that there's become kind of a military aspect to this of taking orders. No pun intended, because doctors are supposed to give orders, and we are taking orders in this case. I think in what you've said is woven the concept of, again, to whose benefit are we working? Even in the situation, I think the word doctor has its roots in teaching. The word doctrine, orthodoxy, and so forth. The original word has to do with teaching, and we are supposed to be that. We're supposed to be teaching our patients, and it's not up for us to force our patients per se, but to give them the panorama, the map upon which they can make their choice. So if it were a good car salesman, you lay out the case for your RAV4 that you want to sell, and then it's up to that person to decide if he wants to buy it. And you can't force that person or mandate that person to have a RAV4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. That's your pathway. And I think we've gotten away from that. But in the general Hippocratic Oath and kind of on the ethical basis, have we moved away from that? I know there are new Hippocratic. This is an oxymoron. They can't be a new Hippocratic Oath, but there are new Hippocratic-like oaths, or that are being promulgated that have more devotion kind of to this communitarian, dare I say, community-based concept of health. We're not treating individuals anymore. And I think some of the vaccine push is towards that. Is there a rationale to give a baby hepatitis B vaccine and so forth? And, I don't think that many babies are going to be IV drug abusers and whatnot. Have we kind of just put them in as units for some greater good down the road, which is communitarian based rather than individual?
I think there's an element of that. I do. I think that that's a justification for it too. I think that's presented as a justification. And I think that when you mention these new, for want of a better word, these new Hippocratic oaths, which of course is a contradiction in terms, as you pointed out. But I think that part of that is to get people, particularly younger physicians and younger healthcare providers, to buy into this aspect of it, to buy into this sort of philosophy of healthcare as it being some sort of a herd-based kind of approach rather than an individual-based approach. That said, I think a lot of it, in my opinion, is disingenuous, because the short answer is they don't tell that to the patient. They don't tell the mom whose baby is getting a hepatitis B vaccine when they're barely out of the womb that the odds that this is going to benefit this child, certainly during their minor years, is essentially zero. They don't tell anybody that. They tell them this is a standard vaccine that we give at birth, period. And their justification would be this is a public health measure that we have, that our society has accepted. So the question to my mind becomes, does the individual have the right to actually have informed consent for everything that is done to them, or don't they? You know, and we've been through this for over the decades, haven't we, Randy? With forced sterilization of people in mental institutions, all this kind of thing. And historically, when these things have been brought to light in front of people, when they've truly seen the light of day, people have rejected them pretty uniformly. But when you've got something that seems to be relatively, quote unquote, harmless and has been promoted to an extent that most people don't give it a second thought, and it is essentially, in many cases, disingenuously promoted, it's just, this is what we do, this every baby gets this, then I think a tremendous amount of this flies under the radar. And I think the other thing just to consider is you know, again, who's getting paid here? Who's making the money? You know,
that famous Latin friend of mine, cui bono.
Right. Exactly. So, you know, you just realize that, you know, how much does whichever company produces whichever hepatitis B preparation they're giving to every child born in the, you know, how much, what is the annual sum of money that
Right.
they earn. And you know, and so the person who says, well, I don't want it, or the doctor who resists that, they again risk losing money. They risk getting in trouble with their superiors. And yet the folks that are just pushing these things, you know, you mentioned the whole thing with narcotics. One would think that the population at large would be extremely suspicious of the intentions of big pharma in the wake of the Purdue pharma scandal with all of the you know, misuse of opioids. However, I think they just again moved the goalposts, and they said, well, this is an emergency. This is a public health emergency. We have to do this. And if some people, you know, they don't even admit it, but even if a few people are hurt, it was necessary. And so people are constantly getting, I find it very difficult to take these sort of mandates with any kind of, even a grain of salt, because the track record of these, of our people running our institutions, the people running our profession is so poor, to be honest with you, that it's really hard to assume that they're operating in good faith, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'd like to kind of circle back to this a little bit later, but I have a couple of questions prepared, and based on your recommendations for medical freedom, we could maybe touch on those a little bit. I could pop them up on the screen, but just to start, before I do that, proportionality. So there's always going to be some tension between the rights of the individual and the rights of the group. You know, I mean, classic is my right to wave my arms around ends at your nose. And so we have the right to do our own stuff, but we can't have negative externalities for others. So in the case of COVID, you know, proportionality, was the response proportionate to the threat? You know, were they honest brokers with us? I mean, again, my prototypical example is the zombie apocalypse. You know, zombies land, and if there's an anti-zombie vaccine, you know, should everybody get it so you don't run the risk of having your wife come home being a zombie and you're not aware of it until too late? In the case of COVID-19, were the measures an overreaction, or did they effectively mitigate a larger catastrophe?
You're asking my opinion on that?
Well, or you know, was this a zombie apocalypse? Was there rationale for this? When they basically did declare a zombie apocalypse and locked us down, as if it had been, you know, I don't know. I mean, that's just it's a whole open-ended question, I guess. But do you think this was a reasonable effort? And how do we get to judge this in real time next time?
My answer, do I think this was a legitimate effort? I would say, in light of all of the, frankly, lies that we've seen about so many elements of the whole COVID situation, I think no. I think that we still don't have, look, I don't think there's very many people who have honestly, in their own mind, regardless of what they would say in public, who have honestly looked at the origins of the virus, are still going to say it came from scaly anteaters, right? And we still can't get the people who are in charge of the response to admit that it came out of that lab. And the odds that it didn't come out of that lab are exactly zero. You know that, I know that, and the man in the moon knows that, and they still won't even admit that. Now, that raises the question of what were they doing with it in the lab in the first place, and why were they, as there's very good information out there that people can get on the internet and find themselves, that there were people, I mean, there was the Chinese fellow who ended up dead, putting in a patent for a COVID vaccine almost before the thing got out of Wuhan. I mean, it wasn't even in Italy yet by the time this guy had claimed this. So it means they're working on a vaccine before the fact, which basically means, and this is, Bobby Kennedy said this and others have said this, all of this research that's taking place, whether it's at Ralph Barrick's lab at North Carolina, or whether it's taking place at Wuhan, or whether it's taking place in some lab in the backwoods of California, or whether it's taking place in the Ukraine or wherever else they might be doing it. This is basically bioweapons research. They're developing a potential bioweapon, and they're developing a platform for the antidote for the bioweapon. That's what this was. And we can't even get them to admit that it came out of the lab yet. So if you can't even stand to this date, you can't even get the absolute fundamental origin of it. And I'm not saying it was released intentionally. I don't know. I have no way of knowing that. But I do know for a fact, and I would challenge any serious person to explain to me how it came from a scaly anteater, with the changes in the fear and cleavage site and all this stuff that just didn't happen in that strain of coronaviruses.
Oh, yeah, no, my point has always been, it could have been that, or it could have been this, but there was no opportunity for open debate. The way we get to science, as the body of knowledge, is by practicing science as the critical weighing of hypotheses. And
Absolutely.
So if Dr. Fauci, at some point early on thinks it might be, but then all of a sudden everyone clams up simultaneously, that's omerta. That's a mafiosi type of code of silence.
Which is exactly what happened. We have documentation of that, don't we, Randy? I mean, that's what happened.
Yeah. So if you see that is evidence. When I was a kid back in the Jurassic, and my parents said, don't go into this cabinet over here. Well, the first thing you're going to do is go in. The reason that people say things and they tell you to avoid something for a reason, because there's something hidden there. And so I think we all are familiar with this concept. And so this right from the get-go that you couldn't even discuss it was, I think, telling. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to hide.
Right.
If you do your, I don't know, certain form completely and accurately, whatever, you don't care who really looks at it and whatnot. Obviously. Anyway, I'd like to kind of go, literally over some of your resolutions. Since it is the new year, you gave us some happy New Year's resolutions, and I'm going to pop them up here for everybody. These are things to abide by. 10 New Year's resolutions to restore medical freedom. And so, how did we lose it? Where did it go? Why do we need to restore it? How to? And here they are. So with this one, I think we've gone over a little bit. Speak the truth about COVID at every opportunity. You can mention any of these, or we can go on to the next. But let's hear your thoughts.
I think just on the first one, I would just say that, and I took the opportunity to do that in our last little exchange just now. I think that it's really important that people realize we have to get back. And again, I don't know whether it was released intentionally or not. I have no way of knowing that, but I know it got out of the lab, and I know anybody who seriously investigated it knows it got out of the lab. Hell, Jon Stewart knew it came out of the lab in 2021. So it's this is not. we have to be able to speak forthrightly at some level about what's going on here. If we can't, then what are we doing? We're not going to get anywhere. So that's the first thing. And I think that, I put down a couple things that I kind of say to people now. I think it's a bioweapon. It was a bioweapon with an antidote. The bioweapon got out. People, I don't know if they panicked or if they intended to do it, but the whole, the horse got out of the barn. And then they developed this product, which is basically the antidote to the bioweapon. They pushed that on people, partly because they could make a fortune and partly because they probably thought they had to get the genie back in the bottle. And then, they went ahead and at every level of society just violated civil rights to the extent that they felt they could do it. And I can't be 100% certain about intention at every level of society, but I can tell you that that's what happened. And I think it's important that we just come to terms with that. And we don't just say, well, we don't really know what happened, or, oh, geez, it's a black box, or, oh, it's all down the memory hole. I think that that's a very important thing to not allow people to get away with. The second thing I would say is that, I think that we really need to encourage other physicians to really, and elected officials to respect medical freedom. And when I say medical freedom, we have another article there that kind of tries to codify it a little bit, but essentially to allow the individual patient to have bodily autonomy and to have absolute right to real informed consent before they have anything done to their body. Honestly, Randy, I'm not sure why that's really that controversial a concept. I think that violating somebody's bodily autonomy.
Well, so it's our body ourselves for abortion, but your body, yourself, my body when it's vaccines, I guess.
Exactly. And why, how did we get to this point? How did we get here? And I think that's something that's a very well put. And I think that's something we really have to come back and look at. Why is it okay to my mind, it's not okay to violate somebody's bodily autonomy.
Well, so just to be devil's advocate here, we don't still have the smallpox vaccine circulating, and let's stipulate it was successful, because I've never seen a case of smallpox, and I know that it existed, or at least I surmise it did. If people did, opted out for their bodily autonomy not to get smallpox vaccine and kept the virus alive, we wouldn't have the situation currently obtained of having zero smallpox around, and nobody has to have smallpox vaccine anymore. So, well, can we stipulate that as a vaccine success and a serious illness eliminated? You tell me.
Let's, for argument's sake, let's assume for this argument that that's true. Okay, let's assume that that's true. I would say if you're going to repeat that, then the burden has to be very heavily on the people that are pushing to repeat that this product that they're trying to impose upon people is going to be effective. And the burden must be on them to demonstrate that it truly is safe and effective, rather than just raising this mantra in the mainstream media that it is. Again, we look and we say, how disingenuous is it? There's that recording that's circulating on Twitter, I know, where it shows how the claims go from 100% effective to 97% effective to 85% effective, down to 16% effective over a period of about a year and a half. That all should be determined way far in advance. The way they did an end around on it, Randy, was just telling us it was the zombie apocalypse. So now they get away with saying, well, but this didn't work. So my answer to that approach would be, you fouled it up this time. We're not falling for it again. We'll let the zombies run wild next time because you screwed us over and there weren't any zombies at the end of the day. So forget it.
That's the thing. So in the Clayton Baker version, let's say we got you and people as forthright as you to agree that there is now a different zombie apocalypse, and it is and it's not COVID. And I have to kind of push back a little bit when you were talking about Wuhan and calling this a bioweapon. It seems to me somewhat contradictory to have it be bioweapon and then also not be severe enough to be zombie apocalypse. So, I don't think personally I mean, I think they were studying. I'm not sure it was a bioweapon. It could have been potentially. I don't think at the stage of its release, inadvertent or not.
Fair enough. So let me qualify that by saying, number one, some bombs are duds, and number two, that I'm not saying that at the time it got out it was fully developed or fully perfected, or that they could have ever known whether. I mean, these guys get a lot of stuff wrong, Randy. So maybe that I'm saying it was the intention of that research. I'm a full believer of what Bobby Jr. has said about this, that the only logical reason to do that kind of research is to fool around with bioweapons. There's no good reason to take a virus and make it more transmissible, more dangerous. What are you going to do with that as dispassionate scientific research? How are you going to use it? How are you going to use it? You're going to just take it to a small group of people in the Amazon and give it to them? There's no way to make any use out of that that's positive. The only way to use that stuff is as a weapon eventually.
So again, as devil's advocate, I have my gain of function research article up at Brownstone, and so I know more than I did a little while ago. But gain of function, certainly the term of art, was not for viruses originally. It was for proteins, and you commensurately you could have a loss of function. So it's tinkering, and you tinker with something, and then you see whether it gained or lost any particular function, and then the term itself, no pun intended, infected the virus world and became gain of function. But we don't talk about loss of function. But again, most changes in genome are going to be loss of function. And I also push back whether something can be simultaneously more transmissible and more dangerous, because usually those are counter directions to each other. But let's again say that was the intent. I don't deny that the intent was slightly nefarious, and Wuhan is likely the bioweapons area. But the question then becomes, when you outlaw it, whether it disappears. We outlawed narcotics. We outlawed all kinds of drugs, and there's still drug trade, and people are still cooking cocaine and meth and whatever. So there's always going to be something happening. I think EcoHealth Alliance was promoted here as a foot in the door of China's bioweapons lab, so we could have like a CIA-ish presence there. And so the question is, it's going to happen anyway, and it's going to happen in China. Do you want to be totally ignorant about it when and how and if it does happen, or do you want to kind of maintain conversational contacts with the people involved? So you have lunch with them and so forth, and whatever. Maybe you suss it out. Maybe it's I think China was doing it as a double cover to get information from Peter Daszak and whatnot, and we had maybe better techniques than they did, and they glom it on just the way they steal stuff from General Motors and whatnot and make better cars for themselves. So I think there was a back and forth amongst the spycraft thing, and I think it's a very difficult concept to outlaw it. We have had our kind of moratoria on funding this. I don't know if we're in a second one right now, but it was there, it was lifted, back again, so forth, about gain of function. So I think people are a little bit skeptical and wary about it. But I also think it's one of those things that it's going to be difficult to undo. It's like water flowing downhill.
I think it's difficult. So if you want to, I guess what I would say is you can argue whether it's outlawing all of it versus outlawing 99% of it and being very careful about the small amount that you do. I would just reply by saying, look what happened the last time they started on this stuff. I mean, what good? Here we've had in my opinion, the greatest tragedy since World War II worldwide as a result of doing this stuff. And it wasn't because of China, it was because of us. China had a hand in it, but EcoHealth Alliance was funded by yours and my tax. The COVID was our tax dollars at work. So, how about we don't do it for 10 years? How about we outlaw it for 10 years and see how terrible we're doing then? I mean, again, it's sort of kind of like, how many times I think this is a classic example of what the military industrial complex always argues. I just watched the Oppenheimer movie, and it's why we're going to build these things because the Russians are going to build these things. And so the Russians are going to build bigger ones because we're going to build bigger ones. Well, where does it end? Where does it end? I'm not an anti-nuclear, no nukes kind of person, but this is a great excuse to keep doing this research.
Yeah.
And the track record of this research is pretty abysmal in the wake of COVID. So you can make an argument you guys couldn't be trusted with this research.
No, I understand that. I just think it's a difficult proposition. I was got in a little bit of an argument at a New Year's Eve party with a Brazilian who hated Donald Trump for his having left the Paris Accords. And I don't think our leaving the Paris Accords made much difference in terms of eco health, to use the term in a different vein, because basically all the West has done is offloaded their pollution to India and China and so forth, people who were places that are not in the Paris Accords, and all you wind up doing is compromising your own development techniques by just staying away from, by being kind of an ostrich, sticking your head in the sand about certain things. It's not like that stuff does not go on. You have to kind of be aware. It's hard to get genies back in bottles, and once Einstein et al. Worked on these various concepts, there was going to be nuclear this or that, and so I'm going to table that a little bit for us, so we can maybe go on.
I would just say one thing parenthetically to that. I think I agree with everything you just said, and we're supposed to be the good guys. And who is the only country that's dropped an atom bomb on anybody? We are. So, we have to start asking ourselves as a nation, this is an excuse to some extent. It's an excuse for the people in positions of extreme power to continue doing whatever the hell they want to keep doing. I mean, whose government funded the development of the SARS-CoV-2 virus? The United States, probably with China, but the United States. Who's the only country that's dropped an atomic bomb on anybody? It's the United States. We have to ask ourselves, are we really the good guys here? I don't know that we are.
Yeah, no, I think we are. And as far as the nuclear bomb, I'm not going to go into the rationale per se of that, but there were lives saved. It would have been
100%. 100%. I'm not disagreeing with any of it. All I'm saying is, at the end of the day, it wasn't Russia that let COVID loose, and that funded COVID, and it wasn't the Brazilians or whoever else you wanted, or the North Koreans. It was us. And so our track record is not that good in the large here. We say, well, we got to worry about, because someone else is going to do it anyway. Well, we're the ones causing this disaster in the first place. So maybe other people ought to be worried about us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I saw the same Jon Stewart episode, and he says science is the cure for the problem that was brought about by science. That's he's kind of echoing Homer Simpson's quote about beer being the solution to and cause of all problems.
Right.
So that is a human thing. I mean, we do stuff and then we figure out ways to undo it. And I think overall we limp towards progress. And I'm not a progressivist. I'm technically a conservative because I think it's always important to conserve what's right. But that is in the face that there's always going to be a changing landscape of things that are possible. Anyway, I would like to, about things that are possible, I'd like to wonder whether this is possible. This is number 4. We've skipped a little bit, but I'd like you to touch on this.
So the notion is here's something that the people, I think, again, I think that people are looking at the small picture when I think a bigger picture is at play. As you know well, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has a newly proposed pandemic agreement. And also they are amending their IHR, which is their international health regulations. And the notion is that in the wake of the COVID catastrophe, you need to centralize power more in order to have a coordinated response if and when this happens again. That's my understanding of it. That's the rationale in the writ large that they're describing. The problem with it is that if you look at the language in more detail, as people like Kat Lindley and David Bell and others have done in great detail, and there's others besides that, they just are 2 people I happen to know and follow, you realize that what this really looks like is pretty much a blatant power grab. It's the person who is the director general of the WHO, now it's Tedros, but it could be someone else in a year or two, essentially, under this new agreement, has the authority to declare a global pandemic, at which point the member nations that are signatories to this have to follow their rules and regulations regarding the response to this declared emergency. And again, in wake of how beautifully, smoothly, and benevolently everything happened over the last 4 years, I think a lot of people are very, very adamant that this is not a good idea. And then furthermore, if you look at the amendments to the IHR, which David Bell points out very astutely, already breaks numerous elements of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. These no longer become recommendations. These have the force of international law. And so it's essentially codifying all of the stuff that happened during COVID with lockdowns, with forced vaccination or mandated vaccination, with other infringements on civil liberties. And it's codifying them as this top-down rule of law, rule of international law, and it can be declared essentially at their time of their choosing.
Which isn't fascist at all.
Exactly. And so the issue that I put up in my article was, okay, so if you do nothing, if you're a signatory, I think the way it works, and I could be wrong about this, but I think it's pretty close. If you are a member of the WHO as a country and you do nothing, then, silence confers consent in this instance in their mind. If you choose by a given date, I think it's in May, that you don't want to be a part of it, you can opt out. My viewpoint is, and I'm not the only person with this viewpoint, I've talked to other people who are knowledgeable about it, like Kelly Victory, and the attitude is, this is a blatant power grab. And if the organization is going to try and pull this, why do we need to be a part of it? We could stay a member of the United Nations. Trump wanted to get us out of the WHO, and I think he was right about that. Why would a sovereign nation cede power? And as David Bell also said, Tedros very disingenuously claimed that there was no loss of sovereignty in these proposed amendments or this new agreement. And yet David Bell and his associate, if you read that article, just pick it clean. I mean, it's absolutely what it is. Like you said, it's not fascist at all. It's totally fascist. And so, when you're dealing with an organization with that sort of an approach, why do you want to just say, well, we're going to say no thanks to this one, but we'll wait for your next one? My attitude is they don't have any police power at this point. You just leave. And the United States we could leave tomorrow. I mean,
it's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, which I have found through the years hugely instructive for all kinds of medical situations. People assume the wizard is saying these things, and the wizard is omniscient, and the wizard actually is reasonably benign once he's uncovered as just a small guy. He points out to the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion that they actually have the qualities they were looking for. It's already within themselves. They exhibited them in their pathway to Oz. And I think people really need that. They need a little bit more self-empowerment. And hopefully you, amongst others, can bring that to them. We can be the good witch of the West. I forget. Anyway, leaving aside the wizard.
You're saying I'm Glenda?
It's not. You could do worse. So I'd like to maybe see if we can get to some of your other points, and then segue to other topics potentially. Sure. So do you feel like touching on this one at all?
Sure. I think that this one is really a pretty straightforward one. I think that at this point, the risk benefit of these remaining mRNA vaccines is terrible. And I think that if that's the case, then they really should be. I'll put it this way: a lot of medications have been removed from the market, including vaccines in the past, for a lot less than the demonstrated and frankly even admitted toxicities of the mRNA COVID vaccines. The classic example was the swine flu vaccine back in the 70s. There were a handful. I can't remember if it was 6 or 12. Somehow I remind it was some multiple of 6. But there was a handful of serious Guillain-Barré syndrome cases with that swine flu vaccine, which was being pushed very heavily at that time. And it went off the market. Look at Vioxx. Vioxx has certainly had its problems, but Vioxx, I'm not sure Vioxx is that much more problematic. It doesn't have the positive aspect.
No, and nor was Fen-Phen, frankly.
Right.
Fenfluramine, I thought had reasonable benefits, acknowledging certain risks, because we were talking about people who were morbidly obese, and they had all kinds of heart issues and CHF, very likely within short time frames, absent diminishment of their weight. And Fen-Phen maybe caused some CHF, but in the general scheme of things, the problem was worse.
Right. And nobody ever tried to force anybody to take Fen-Phen. Nobody ever tried to force anybody to take Vioxx.
Right.
Now, if this is the standard, we're supposed to be a profession that has a standard of care. And if the standard of care is that if something as dangerous as Fen-Phen or as dangerous as Vioxx or as dangerous as the swine flu vaccine leaves the market, then this one should have been off the market a long time ago.
So I think you come to the crux of the situation, and I don't know if I'm not sure which number it is on your list, but it's the NCVIA. And I'm just going to preface slightly. We see a lot of homeless on the streets in California and whatnot. And if you go back to ancient times of 10 years ago, there were homeless, but there weren't like encampments and so forth. There's generally speaking a law that happens that changes our response to a situation, and it may make it better and it may make it worse. In this case, I think it's Boise versus Martin. Nobody really knows about this thing, but it's City of Boise versus some guy named Martin who's homeless, and they wanted to put him, I don't know, someplace, and he objected, or the ACLU got on his case and made it such that Boise couldn't remove him from his encampment someplace unless they had a home for him to put him in, an actual residence. And so this made a situation where it would cost $200,000 or some number to remove a guy from the street if you didn't have that housing built already. So if you have 1,000 guys homeless in the streets of Boise, or 500 or whatever the number is, that's going to be 500 times 200,000. It becomes an onerous number that you cannot possibly. Anyway, so what has happened is people, have stopped picking up the homeless. And there's some legal debates around the edges of this, whether it's being interpreted correctly, and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not the legal expert here. But in a lot of cases, there's some base law that happens, thus that these other things happen. And I would like to kind of get at the elephant in the room, which is the NCVIA. And maybe talk about the seminal moment of 1986 versus now, and the proposition by Henry Waxman in Congress to get this law passed. Can you touch on that? And do you see this as kind of the original sin aspect?
Well, yeah, I think you're right on target, Randy. And I think that your analogy of that homeless decision is a really it's a really apt analogy for a lot of reasons, because what you described very well is that these unintended consequences and these downstream effects of these decisions they're untold, and they're realized perhaps years or decades later. And I think that's what happened with the 1986 NCVIA. So essentially, my understanding, which I think is pretty, I've read the act and I've written about it before. I don't have the expertise on it that, say, Bobby Kennedy Jr. has. He's a lawyer, I'm not, or that someone like Merrill Nass has. But essentially, in the 1980s, the pharma industry approached the federal government saying, we're going to stop making vaccines. And the reason we're going to stop making vaccines is because they are unavoidably unsafe in the sense that there's always a potential for toxicity with them. And we're giving them to huge numbers of people. And if we were to do that, then we can basically be bankrupted, if they're by class action suits, whatever. And so what ended up happening was this act was passed by law, federal law in 1986, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, that did two things. It basically exempted vaccine manufacturers from product liability, with some restrictions, incidentally, which quite frankly, a lot of the manufacturers of COVID vaccines, to my understanding, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I look at those and I say they broke a lot of those restrictions. But anyway, by and large, it protects them very, very, gives them broad product liability that doesn't really exist in other aspects of pharma or other aspects of industry. It's a real sweetheart deal. And then the second thing that it does is it creates this government fund that is the repository of people's complaints if something goes wrong. So in a sense, you don't sue the vaccine industry or the pharma industry, you sue the federal government. And we all know how easy and straightforward and productive that act usually is. And so essentially what happened, the downstream effect, you mentioned the whole thing with the homeless situation. It costs $200,000 to house a homeless person, let's say, in a city like Boise or like LA. So to a certain extent, you leave them on the street, but then when you have to get them off the street, what do? You have this whole cottage industry of peddled influence between people who build housing and politicians.
Yeah, it's a rent. The term is called rent seeking, which people get confused. It's nothing to do with housing. It's really an archaic use of the word rent. And basically people are looking for sinecures. They're looking for special carve outs for their own selves. And oddly enough, I think we both have MD after our name here and yours. The concept of an MD being able to write prescriptions nobody else can, maybe some PAs can or whatever, but that is also a rent-seeking proposition. There are all different types of doctors running around, and in the early 20th century, I believe, or late 19th, doctors got this special right. It was a rent-seeking proposition between physicians and government to allow and carve out only doctors being able to do this one thing, which is write prescriptions. So, getting back, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but getting back to the methadone proposition versus alcohol, this is actually a rent-seeking concept as well. The fact that there is no alcohol replacement therapy. If you're addicted to whiskey, nobody gives you this clear water-like liquid they call vodka to replace every day. I mean, it would take care of your withdrawal symptoms.
Right.
But we do it with methadone and Suboxone because, oddly enough, we have the right to prescribe those things, but we can't prescribe alcohol. We're left with bartenders and liquor stores, package stores doing that. And so somehow that was the cat left out of the bag. So there's no alcohol replacement therapy. But if we had the right to prescribe alcohol, let's say we were in Afghanistan and alcohol was completely illegal and only physicians could prescribe alcohol, I would give you dollars to donuts or vice versa, that we would be doing alcohol replacement and prescribing it because we don't want people to get delirium tremens. And so forth. So it's a funny thing. This is a rent-seeking. This is kind of the economic aspect. But the NCVIA has carved out this place where pharmaceutical companies can do much better, more guaranteed money than making a drug. It's a huge impediment to bring a pharmaceutical to market, and probably a certain extent a vaccine. But a vaccine, once it's given, is in this separate market where it's protected.
Right. And so what some of whether they were intended consequences, whether Henry Waxman intended this to happen or not, I have no idea. But I have a feeling that some very enterprising people in pharma figured this out very quickly if they didn't know it in 1985. But, number one, it encourages them to, number one, invest in vaccines. It encourages, number two, to get them on that pediatric schedule. And number three, encourages them to come up with new and various ways to frankly, call products vaccines, which traditionally might not be considered vaccines. So now we're looking at a situation where we used to have a handful, maybe 6 or 7. I think the number is 7 back at the time on the schedule. Thank you very much. And now we're up to 21 or 23. And there were just 3 more added to the adult vaccine schedule effective January 1st, 2024. There was the updated COVID, there was the RSV, and there was some new there's the monkeypox for certain populations, and then there was some new combination bacterial vaccine. I'm forgetting the name of it. So this just becomes this snowball effect. And it's not a coincidence that it all began in 1986, nor is it a coincidence. We were talking about the swine flu vaccine. That was a classic example of vaccines being held to a similar standard as other pharmaceuticals, but that, of course, was back in the 70s. And so we're looking at this situation where we just created this tremendous market for not only vaccines, but for basically calling whatever you can a vaccine. And that takes us into the whole mRNA platform, because they're developing mRNA products for cancers and so on, which they're going to, of course, tell us those are vaccines, because if they're vaccines, then they're protected by the 1986 NCVIA Act. So this becomes a giant motivator to create more vaccines and to, in my opinion, in many cases, mistitle or misclassify new medications as vaccines in order to make them basically free from product liability.
Yeah, it's a great trampoline. So this is an article from Marin County Health, and I think they're a nonprofit. I don't think they have a political stance per se for against vaccines, but it's a nice document I couldn't find elsewhere, which goes over by the decades from the 40s the vaccine schedule, and this is kind of what I cut my teeth on as a physician. I graduated medical school in 1981, and I practiced in doing primary care for nearly 30 years, and I wasn't that involved with children per se, but I had to keep up here and there when people did immigration and whatnot, and here and there give out vaccines as well. We were part of the network, and people had to have their school forms signed. So this is kind of like the coterie of vaccines that were part of my armamentarium, and you can see as the time goes on, there's more and more. Now the question here's hepatitis B 95 popping in. Again, this is this was not in my ranges for neonates and whatnot, but this vaccine schedule is getting more and more popular, but it seems to really take off in the 2000s. Mm-hmm. And we're gonna fast forward. This is a lot hard to read; it's too small. But the vaccine schedule is getting busier and busier. This is 2011, and so now we've added. I probably can't see this unless I expand it, but there's pneumococcal vaccine we're giving to kids, meningococcal vaccine giving to kids. This 4 months over here, we're seeing PCV, a 4-month-old getting pneumococcal. Now, I don't think this is a huge concern for children. And then now we've just moved on. There's hepatitis A, hepatitis B. Do kids really need an influenza shot? Right. Here they're talking about yearly shots for influenza for babies. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I just think this is missed the risk part of the risk benefit schedule or equation. You have to give, let's say smallpox, if they were still running around, fine, you give the smallpox vaccine because that's a huge danger. Right. And I think there's an argument for rubella because of rubella syndrome in naive young pregnant women. But a lot of these don't necessarily have the benefits, especially when you start adding, I don't know if it's on this page here, this is 2018, this only goes up to 2018, so I apologize. But if we go back to that other, we go back to this, let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah, we go back to this page here. Does it have coronavirus? No, it's 2019. But now they've added the coronavirus one. Mm-hmm. And again, there's no risk to children of coronavirus.
Correct.
This is where things have really gone off the rails.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. And that was a very nice summary. If you can please email me that, because that's a very nice sequence of slides there. But I think there's at least two things to keep in mind here. The first is, I think you rightly keep circling back to this notion of a population benefit. Okay, because you keep mentioning, say, the smallpox, which for the sake of this argument, we've agreed is, a sterilizing vaccine that helps save the world. Okay. But the overwhelming majority of those vaccines on that modern list don't do anything of the kind.
Yeah.
They provide no population benefit whatsoever. If I get the flu, okay, the benefit if I get the flu, the benefit of having gotten the flu shot, even as they purport it now, is it takes, I think it was the CDC, it takes it from wild to mild. And instead of it being this big 16-point buck, it's now this tiny little Bambi. That's literally what their flu advertisement was this year. Well, if I want to deal with the buck, if I want to tussle with the buck instead of with the Bambi, whose business is it of that any but mine? To mandate these or to put these on a schedule, and there are employers that mandate the flu vaccine. For what? So I don't get it as bad.
I gotta say, if I ran an NBA team, and I was paying out, average salary $8 million, and each game, let's say each player is making $100,000 per game. I could see a situation of mandating the flu shot because they're playing in the winter and they miss 4 or 5 games, or they're under the weather, they don't play well, and I lose out on the playoff position or whatever. Because there was one year, 20 something years ago, where I was watching this and I read sports and whatnot, and Kobe Bryant, had come down with the flu, and he missed games. And he was off and kind of kiboshed their season for them because he was miserable. And I was like, I think if I were the team doctor, I would probably get rid of everything except the flu shot. Give everyone the flu shot at the beginning of the season and then go from there. And I like the flu shot. I took many flu shots. I found it was a good business decision for myself because I saw a lot of cases of flu almost every day all winter. I didn't get that sick. And I thought it was more of a Bambi. I don't think that's a bad analogy per se, but it was my choice. I didn't make all my patients do it.
Right.
And I think if you're not in the military or part of a SWAT team or NBA or the Lakers or whatever, then you shouldn't necessarily be in that position. I don't think it's a rational thing, but I think there is potentially a business model motivation for it where there's some choice about it. I don't want to play for the Lakers. I'm going to leave. Jonathan Isaac, bowed out on the Magic, and I think a fair number of other players, Kyrie Irving and whatnot. And I don't agree with everything that comes out of Kyrie Irving's mouth, but I certainly backed him on this because he had already had the illness. There was this crazy, topsy-turvy through the looking glass aspect towards, the dicta and doctrines of public health that ignored natural immunity. It's a very weird time.
It's a weird time, and you cannot. This is the other thing, though, Randy. You went to medical school, and as best I can tell, you paid attention. I went to medical school, and I tried to pay attention. And there's some things at the very beginning of the whole COVID situation, throughout the whole 3-4 years, that I'm thinking to myself, where I went to a reputable school. I knew that the standard evolution of a respiratory virus when it's new into a population is that it tends to mutate to become more transmissible and less virulent.
Yes, exactly right.
And that's just the way. That's like the force of the that's the force of a natural law.
It kills everybody. If it's like Ebola, it doesn't. It either burns bright and short or burns low and wide.
And increasingly low and increasingly wide. It's got the force of a natural law. And how many times I heard Fauci and everyone else absolutely contradict.
This is the most transmissible one yet.
Right, exactly. And
that would have been like good news.
But what did they say? We don't know about its virulence. That's what they said time and time. They're lying. People have to know these people looked us in the face for years and they lied. Someone who paid attention in medical school, and first, I think this was my second year of medical school, and we did virology, knew that they were lying. And they lied and they lied and they lied again. Now, how many times do you get to lie to somebody who knows better before you lose all your credibility?
I'm going to trot out my Fauci because I've had positive reports on it. But in 2004 or 5, he was talking whatever version of the flu was out then. And it was a question on a talk show, and somebody called in, and I've actually listened to a fair amount of it now. Someone was asking, should I get this year's flu shot if I already had this year's flu? And he's like, no, you should not. There's absolutely no reason, since you've had full exposure to the virus itself. You've seen all of its proteins. There's no reason to get the vaccine, which is only one single protein of this, strain. And it's like you're basically adding nothing to the equation by getting a vaccine after the fact. And I think Dr. Fauci is a smart enough guy. My understanding is he graduated, one of those cum laude type categories from Holy Cross, and he went to medical school. I don't think he's an idiot, but I do think he was bought out or CYA. He had an episode of personal, needing to correct things, kind of a mafia exposure by being involved with EcoHealth Alliance, having funded it. And I think everything went, like mafia, like Omerta, because there was personal exposure for their brand, for their names, for their, pensions or whatever, or future regulatory capture of jobs at Pfizer or whatever. I think there was some aspect of that where everything went topsy-turvy, and/or my other theory is that it became a political, kind of a clown car that you could fit as much into and drive through the erstwhile Trump presidency.
Right. I think you're right about all those things. I think that it definitely, but the end result for a discerning individual is that, I posted something on Twitter the other day in response to another Brownstone article, and I said, Mandy Cohen is essentially she's basically the big pharma equivalent of Flo from Progressive or Lilly for AT&T. The CDC has lost its credibility to the point where it's now essentially an advertising agency for big pharma, specifically for the vaccine industry. And people know this intuitively at this point because they've just been lied to too many times. Yeah, and I think the only other thing I would follow up with that is that, there was a really great meme of the political cartoon. There's two guys in black suits standing at the grave, and the gravestone reads CDC's credibility. And they said, did it die of COVID or with COVID? and someone attached that to the tweet I put on there. I said, boy, that does it 10 times better than what I could run.
That's really great.
But but the reality is that you only get to lie and prevaricate and BS people for so long before they realize. And again, this is like going back to saying, why do we just say no thank you to the latest ploy of the WHO? You have no credibility. Yeah. There's no, you can't work with someone who can't admit their mistakes, can't admit that there's wrongdoing involved.
And plus, you can't work with people who want to kill you. This is just a silly secondary analogy, but there used to be this kind of dark humor joke in Israel. It's like, what's the difference between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority? Well, the PA wants to drive all the Jews into the sea, and Hamas wants to torture them first. So you basically need a willing partner for peace, and you need a willing partner for your general good health and health. I'm sorry about that, for your well-being and health. And if they are bought out by one form or another, then they're not working for you or looking out for your best efforts and benefits. And so I think that is a telling moment. So I'd like to give you a chance for closing words and thoughts, and as we round out the hour, and then I'm going to give my little plug.
Sure, thank you. Well, again, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and to have a chance to be on your show. So I appreciate that very much. And I've gotten some very nice feedback in the previous episode from some of your listeners. So it's really a pleasure. So thank you very much. And Happy New Year to everybody. I guess what I would say is going into I'm going to just kind of be a bit of a broken record, I'm afraid, but I'm going to say that I really want people to be smart consumers of their healthcare. I want them to be shrewd, kind of buyer beware kind of consumers. There are circumstances you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you need your gallbladder out, you really need your gallbladder out. You can't do that outside of the medical establishment. Realistically, there's not really an avenue for that to happen. There's a lot of things that you have to go into the medical system in order to be able to stay healthy. There are some things that you don't have to do that our profession wants you to do for reasons that are not necessarily in your best interest. And I think that you have to be shrewd and have to be cautious and have to be forthright and say, I've looked into it. If it's something you don't want, and you said, I choose not to do that. And I think every time people do that, not only is it beneficial to them, and you don't just throw everything out, as I said, but if it's something that just plain doesn't make sense to you, an option would be to say to your doctor, make it make sense to me. Explain to me why this is in my best interest. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the time the doctors are so short on time or don't really want to deal with, they'll just say, forget about it. And if that's the case, well, then it probably wasn't that important. But make it make sense to me. Explain to me why I truly need this, and see what happens. But be aware. Don't take your doctor, anyone else's statement as an article of faith.
Absolutely, that's really good advice, and I think people should look forward to your book, and they could also learn as well from following you. And I'm going to put up some of your bona fides here. So this is the article we were talking about here on Brownstone, and they can find you on the author page at Brownstone here. So there's a number of your articles at Brownstone. I recommend Brownstone in general, and they can follow you along. And I believe you're on Twitter at what?
At CJ Baker MD, all lowercase.
Okay, so I didn't have a chance to put that up. I apologize.
That's okay.
And so I'm going to leave everybody with my own book, and this is a way you can help support the podcast if you enjoyed this, or if you just want to send me money in general, because I put it to good use. You can buy my book, hopefully even go get a chance to read it. I started on this before COVID. On 2019 actually was my first hint of this, that there had been all this brouhaha, chatter, talk about the Zika microcephaly, and according to their own calculations, there would be 1 million. I should say this like Dr. Evil. There would be 1 million additional microcephalic babies born every year because of Zika, because of this discovery in Brazil 2015. And fortunately, and thank God, there have been effectively zero every year since then, and even in Northeast Brazil. And there's been no apology. There's no apology tour. When Obama became president, we apologized to the world for all the things you were kind of, hinting at, not the atomic bomb, but, for having been a colonial power, whatever. So he went and apologized all over the place. But there's been no apology for this. I just think I don't think it was a conspiracy at the beginning. It's just a matter of inadequate science that did not get observed and just kind of ran with the press. People had egos and they leaked their various findings to the press before they were adjudicated in the court of law of peer review, et cetera. Such as, that's an imperfect vehicle, but better than nothing. And it's off to the races. And right now, there's going to be around the corner a Zika vaccine,
That's
and
right.
It's going to be added to this list. This is a category error. It's a total mistake to have this because there's no problem there. But my prediction, unfortunately, is that once it's there, it's going to be mandated around the world, or at least in the tropics initially, and then around the world. And nobody's going to know how often they're going to have to take it. They're going to probably take it every 5 years, forever. There's going to be money to be made. Moderna has one, not Pfizer, but I think Sanofi and Takeda and so forth, and probably Pfizer soon enough. And this is going to be one of these rent-seeking sinecure ways of printing money on the backs of people. And then they'll say, guess what? There's no more Zika microcephaly. Yay, right. Like smallpox. Right. And this is just not the case, because there wasn't any there to begin with, to quote Gertrude Stein. Anyway, so that's all I've got for today. I am very much in your debt for being on our show. And you were mentioning of David Bell. He's got some interesting facts. I'll just leave one tiny one, which is that, a lot of the WHO has been subverted by this same vaccine mechanism, because their profits go right into the WHO, and then the WHO gets a large part of its granting outside of governmental grants from the pharmaceuticals because of vaccines. So their mission has been translated from malaria, HIV, tuberculosis into these vaccines. And so this is a misuse of the WHO. Shocking. I know, thank God we're both sitting down. We can move on with our lives without fainting. All right. So thank you, Clayton. I appreciate your time. I look forward to getting together soon, hopefully in person someday.
Great. Thanks very much again for having me.